about Wyandotte history.
Yeah, that's a good day then.
Yeah. I mean, especially what we're talking about tonight, it's some of the most foundational things that everybody should have a good understanding about. So this is a very important night. I just wish we had 7,000 people that was participating with us tonight. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and Kim makes 7. So you guys ready?
Ready.
Mhm.
Okay. Ah, we got more people coming.
Yeah, I will
Okay.
be admitting them as they come in.
And Rebecca's in there. She's mine. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, Daddy.
Okay, so tonight we're talking about some very complex yet very simple things because of the complexity of what has been said about us over the last 350 years by some of these smart people called historians. It has caused a lot of confusion for us today. And a big question has always been asked by a lot of the anthropologists and historians is, who are these Wyandotte people? Where'd they come from? The subject of what we're talking about tonight is, how did the Wyandotte become a tribe? And we're going to talk about a few things that some people have begun to understand as they start to dig through a lot of the old documents that's been hidden in a lot of these university archives. And once a lot more of this knowledge becomes available, hopefully people can better understand that the Wyandotte people, we, us, all of us here, we're kind of odd and weird and unique people. And that makes us kind of different than some of our cousins that are out there, some of the other IROQUOIAN nations. So the first thing that we're going to look at is our objectives. When we ended last month, we were talking about where these people who eventually became known as Iroquois basically settled into. They just showed up in the archaeological record and kind of took things over around most of the Great Lakes, except for Lake Superior. The influence of the Iroquoian people was pretty much from St. Lawrence all the way from the Atlantic Ocean all the way over to Lake Michigan. The influence was pretty heavy. Plus, there were some other Iroquoian peoples that lived in other places on the Great Island. Some of them down in the Cherokee, or not Cherokee, but the Chesapeake Bay region. And then the Cherokee were obviously down in North Carolina, Georgia, South Carolina, Kentucky, Tennessee, down in the heartlands of the Appalachian Mountains. So we'll take a few moments and just take another look at the assigned lands, the homelands, and the formation of some unique and related tribes. There are 3 great confederacies. One of these great confederacies, and they're all Iroquoian people, gets overlooked. They are almost forgotten about, but they are incredibly important to the whole history of what took place in the Great Lakes area. And they are very important to us because the confederacy that gets overlooked is from where we came. Then we're going to take a quick look at two great wars, the arrival of the Europeans, the Great Dispersal, and a new tribe of people. So the Iroquoian people, we were very different. We stood out. Hey, Bert, how you doing? It's good to see you.
Okay, I finally made it.
Yeah, I just saw you pop up there. But the Iroquoian people were different. They just didn't function. They didn't think. They didn't act. They didn't have a lot of beliefs that were similar to their Algonquian neighbors. The language was different. They were very industrious. They were fierce, warlike. And we'll see a little bit later that there was no Algonquian nation that could defeat a Iroquoian nation. The only people who could defeat an Iroquoian nation was another Iroquoian nation. The technologies that the Iroquoians had and their ability to put together strategy was far superior to the Algonquian people that lived around them. One of the most definitive things that separates the Iroquoian people from everybody around them was the longhouses. The longhouses were formed into villages. The villages were surrounded and protected by palisades. They were almost impenetrable by the other nations. And when attacked, the people could basically isolate themselves inside the villages, and they could survive some of the most brutal winters and invaders that were trying to push them out of the land that they had just conquered. Another thing that separated the Iroquoian people from the others was the corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters, because the women of the nations, they were the ones who planted and grew the harvest. The men would actually help take in the harvest, but it was the women's job to basically take care of the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash. Also unique is the matrilineal descent. All of our lineage comes through the women, not the men. And when the Europeans showed up, that blew their minds. They could not comprehend that a people that was as astounding as these Iroquoian people actually let their women kind of be in control of most of the property that they had. And that is something that we have lost in our society today, but I hope we can regain that soon in the coming years. And another unique thing was the matrolocality that the Iroquoian people had. Does anybody know what the matrolocality means? What is that referencing? Can somebody tell me? When a man and a woman get married, to which home does the woman go? In most cases, traditionally through European cultures. Pardon?
The woman. So she would leave her home, he would go to hers or go to
That's-
her clan.
Yep. The matrolocality means that when a man and a woman took each other as mates, the man would go live with his spouse's family. The man lived with the woman did not live with the man. The man basically moved into the longhouse, and he was basically a guest among a lot of other women. And one of the most complicated things about our history, about our traditions, is when these people came into the Ontario region, the Great Lakes region, there is nothing recorded anywhere in any of the traditional narratives, the oral traditions of the people, nor in the Europeans' histories of what their name was. So here we are, some of the most strong people that have ever existed in North America, and we don't even know our name. That's pretty bizarre. But I think in the last couple of years, as I've done research, I think I've found what that name is. I'm going to share it with everybody today and why I think it is the name that I think. And right there it is. The people were given the name Iroquoian by the Europeans. And that name is kind of debated as to where the origin of it came from. It's controversial because it's of European origin. And a lot of people don't like the name, so that there's been here in the last couple of years a push to try and change that. But the Iroquoian name is so embedded in history, it cannot be removed. It is so deeply embedded into the histories of many different nations, to remove it would cause so much confusion. So even though it's kind of a derogatory name, it's a name of European descent, it's a name that we have to keep. And we'll also see here in a little bit that the name Huron, even though it is also derogatory, is a name that we have to keep as well. Most of the Iroquoian peoples, their names, as they claim today, reference a location on the great island that they were assigned to live. There are only two Iroquoian nations whose traditional names do not reference a location on the great island. That is the Wyandotte people and the Cherokee people. The Cherokees' given name for themselves basically is translated as simply the people. and it is singular, it is unique to them, and only that name that they have for themselves can be used by the Cherokee people. Likewise, the name Wyandotte, it does not reference a location on the great island in which we lived. It references one thing that was so unique about all the Iroquoian people that I am making this assumption, and I'm going to say that the original traditional name of these people that are called Iroquoian were actually called Wyandotte, because the name translates as the villagers. All of these Iroquoian people that lived up around the Great Lakes, they had one thing in common. They built these longhouses, they built these villages, and they circled these villages with the palisades. That was unique among the Iroquoian people. So the name Wyandotte, I think, is a good name as a substitute for Iroquoian, but we can't do that because the Iroquoian name is so embedded in history. If we pull it out, it'll cause mass confusion. So our name, our traditional name, is Wyandotte. And I have a tendency to spell it like this that I'm circling, because this little uppercase N is difficult for a lot of people to replicate on keyboards. But this is the way that Dr. Kopris basically says that the name would be spelled in English letters and Latin letters. Does anybody have any questions about that?
Not a question, but just kind of a side note. They probably about a year ago, I think they had stopped doing that other accent or the accent over the A. So, and
Just
the
straight
reason
up
why they,
Wyandotte.
excuse me,
Just straight up Wyandotte.
the with the small N, D, but not that A, not the accent over that A.
Okay.
And that's just because it's not necessary, but and the reason why we do that little N before the D is because it's pronounced differently than just Wyandotte. It's like Wyandotte. So we're trying to, it has a little bit different pronunciation than a hard N. So we're trying to do, each pronunciation has a different syllable for it, or symbol, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And in time, when the language becomes a little bit more prevalent, a lot of this will begin to make more sense to all of us, because our language it's simple, but it's complicated. Okay, any questions, any more comments? Okay. So as we saw last month, when we finished up, there were 3 unique traditions that were formed by these people that moved into the Great Lakes region. We saw that there was the Glen Meyer tradition, the Pickering, the Owasco, and over time, these traditions kind of matured, and in kind of not a complete way, but in a very loose way, they formed these 3 confederacies: the ATTIWANDARONK, the WENDAT, and the Haudenosaunee. And the one confederacy that gets overlooked is the ATTIWANDARONK. And that is the confederacy from which all of our parent nations came out of. And everybody's familiar with the Wendats. Not a lot of people are familiar with the name, even Haudenosaunee, because the name Iroquoian Confederacy is so predominant in history. But these are the 3 confederacies that we're going to take a little bit more time to look at. And when these people began to move into the Great Lakes region, it's generally accepted that they moved into the Great Lakes region somewhere around 900 AD. And it was the Glen Meyer tradition that was the first one that was established. When in Ontario, the name of the traditions is the Ontario Iroquoian traditions, and it's referencing primarily the Attawandarock and the Wendat confederacies and the people that make up those confederacies. And the map here kind of shows a little bit of where the tribes settled into. The red is the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat's the orange, and the Haudenosaunee is the gray. The other Iroquoian nations that are on this map, can people identify the other Iroquoian peoples that are on this map? There's 5 that I have on here, 5 other Iroquoian people. Obviously, the Cherokee should stand out. They're also Iroquoian, but they're a distant Iroquoian. They're unique unto themselves. They are the people. So what other four are Iroquoian nations? Anybody ever heard of the Nottoway? They're Iroquoian. Tuscarora, obviously, because they ended up becoming Haudenosaunee. The Susquehannock and the IROQUOIAN, these two right here became totally defeated by the Haudenosaunee Confederacy during the French and Indian Wars. So we have the Cherokee, Nottoway, Tuscarora, Susquehannock, IROQUOIAN, the ATTIWANDARONK, WENDAT, and Haudenosaunee. Those are the Iroquoian people. And there's a lot of suspicions that there were a lot more people besides those that were actually on the Great Island. And the history books basically show that the Adirondack are known as the neutral confederacy because they laid between the Haudenosaunee and the Wendats. They didn't actively participate in the war that broke out between the two confederacies. They had their own battles that they fought with other Algonquian nations more to the west. But these right here are some of the names of the known and acknowledged Adirondack tribes. And the three that's important to us is the WENRORONON, the HAUDENOSAUNEE, and the Oskid. That's hard to pronounce. You want to try that one, Kim? Anybody want to pronounce these? They're tough. So it's interesting. So I usually have a tendency to default to what the nations actually claim to be representative of. The WENRORONON, they were turtle people, and they're known in the books, the history books, as being turtle people. The HAUDENOSAUNEE, they were wolf, and these guys, they're deer, and that'll come into be important here in a little bit. And also you see that the HAUDENOSAUNEE and the Oskinototon, they are also known as the Chionantati, the Petun, or the Tobacco Nation. And they're a little different because they kind of sprung out as a satellite from the main area in which the Adirondack lived, which was down here on the western shore of Lake Erie. The WENRORONON basically lived just over here to the east of Niagara Falls. But the Chionantati, they basically satellite way up here off of the Georgian Bay, and were kind of isolated to themselves, which would turn out to be a detrimental move for them. The Wendat Confederacy, more people are familiar with these than our own nations. And the Wendats are commonly known as the Huron Confederacy, which that Huron name is probably the center point of a lot of the confusion with our history and our name. Haudenosaunee, there were 5 nations there that became 6, and they are commonly known as the Iroquois Confederacy. But these people are all distantly related. And for a long time, they were friendly among each other. They didn't fight. They conquered the area around the Great Lakes. They lived in harmony. And then something happened, and we'll talk about what that was. And here's the other Iroquoian people that you can find fairly easily in the history books. One of the oral traditions that we have speak about the Chionantati and the Attiwandan of the Wendat people. They are known as the Bear Nation. There is a oral tradition that talks about how the deer was the first animal god, animal spirit, that left the Great Island for the sky. And the bear was unhappy that the deer had left the Great Island, and the bear went into the sky to try and coax and retrieve the deer back. That wasn't successful. A large war ensued, and the deer battled the bear. The deer with his antlers came close to mortally wounding the bear, and the bear would have died in the sky if the Haudenosaunee, the wolf, which I've got them down here as deer. Change that right quick. That's wolf. If the wolf had not intervened, the deer would have killed the bear. And I believe that that oral tradition is talking about the time in which the Chionantati basically satellited off of the Attiwandan and formed a loose alliance just south of the Wendat people. And the Wyandotte became important to us because they are two of our parent tribes. And if it wasn't for the Wolf Nation, who have always served within the Wyandotte people as mediators, they are the ones who try and intervene. They find peace. They've worked as basically law enforcement among the tribe. They have provided the sheriff. They were the ones that basically enacted the tribal laws throughout the nation. And they were standing in the middle of all the other tribes. They were making sure that everybody basically followed the rules. And there were lots of rules. They were peacemakers. The Great War between the WENRORONON and the Seneca is also detailed in an oral tradition by Chief Joseph White. He lived in the Wyandotte area, and he gave his oral tradition that spoke of a war that can be easily associated with the war that took place in 1637, 1638 between the WENRORONON and the Seneca. And this is an important war because this is the war that basically changed the complexion of the great island. This is the war that instigated the defeat of not only many of the Iroquoian nations, but also many of the Algonquian nations that lived on the eastern side of the Mississippi River of North America. The Iroquoian people basically began to fight themselves, which turned into an absolute, almost nuclear war, if you will. But the war started over a woman who was said to be very beautiful. And she was seeking revenge because a war chief of the Seneca had killed her brother. And she wanted to get revenge on this war chief, but she couldn't find anyone who was willing or capable of killing him. She didn't want to be taken in marriage. She didn't want to be anyone's mate. And she was kind of hard, standoffish. And most of the men in the tribe, because of her beauty, wanted her as their mate. So this kind of little ensuing battle between the men took place, and one of the war chiefs of the WENRORONON basically won her heart, but he had to take an unknown pledge before she would pledge herself to him. And he agreed to her pledge, not knowing what it was. They took each other as mates. Then she disclosed what that pledge was. He had to go kill who was his best friend since birth, the war chief of the Seneca Nation. So he went, he actually walked into the family's longhouse, and he walked straight up to his friend, the war chief, and just killed him on the spot. And that started a infuriated rage among the Seneca people that spread over to the other Haudenosaunee people. And they were bent on destroying the WENRORONON, and they were defeated and they were dispersed. The remnants of the WENRORONON basically left, and they sought shelter among the ATTIWANDARONK of the WENDAT people, the WENDAT Confederacy. And also at the same time, there was a big old plague of smallpox. But this is what basically started the war in North America among the Iroquoian people. Not long after that, or just before that, the Europeans arrived. And Cartier, he changed the way in which the politics and the dynamics of war was basically waged, because the Iroquois people took on a lot of the policies of war that was initiated by the European powers when they arrived to North America. The Jesuits arrived in 1611. The Recollects arrived in 1615. The Jesuits started putting order into New France, and the Recollects did something that's also paramountly important. They started the Huron mission. They started this church among these heathen people that they found in North America, because they were heavy into sorcery. They were heavy into witchcraft. Their lives were basically built around a shamanistic society. And the French, the Recollects, and the Jesuits needed to save their souls to keep them from going to eternal damnation. So in order to do that, they started the Huron mission. The name Huron is one of those names that a lot of people love to hate. The name Huron is also a name that a lot of people don't understand was given not just to the Wendats, to the Iroquoian people, but the Algonquian people were also called Hurons by the French. And the French did not care what the people called themselves. They could have cared less. They had so much disrespect for the people, their traditions, who they were, where they came from, that they were all just a bunch of Hurons. And folklore basically says that the name is referencing a wild boar in Europe because of the bristly hair that is on the back of the boar. There's a lot of people that say that that is just folklore, that that is not true, that the name of Huron predates the arrival of the French in North America by several hundred years, and that the name is actually referencing the low-class society in France and was signifying unkept knaves, ruffians, lout, the wretch, the poverty-stricken people who basically were the scum of society. They didn't have an education. They had no education at all. They didn't have much religion outside of the Catholic Church, and they were just poor people. And when the French arrived, they equated that same type of person upon all the natives that lived in North America. Therefore, they became Hurons, no less than the lowest class of society in old France, which is in Europe. Anybody got any questions on that? Because that changes a little bit of what we have always believed the name Huron reference, which was for hundreds of years believed to be the wild boar. But Dr. Bruce Trigger, he did a lot of research on the name, and he found out that that is nothing more than just folklore, that the name is actually referencing an lower class society within France. So Huron went, Huron, oh, yes.
I have a quick question. The recollect, is that like the Catholic Church?
The Recollects were another order within the Catholic Church. They were
Okay.
not Jesuits. They had a
Okay.
whole different theology on the way that they approached Christianity through the eyes of Catholicism. And they were the ones that initially began the missionary adventures within North America. They were
Oh, okay.
Catholic. They were Catholic, just as the Jesuits were, but it would be almost like saying that you have Baptist, you have Southern Baptist, and then you have Free Will Baptist. Just the differences in the way that, you know, all the different Baptists believe, which is just minor, but they identify themselves differently by those small variations in their fundamental core beliefs. It's kind of like the way that the Jesuits were in comparison to the Recollects.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, the name Huron-Wendat, a lot of people are familiar with because this is the Huron Confederacy. And the name Wendat didn't come into play until the French just woke up one day and said, well, why don't we ask these people what they call themselves? And the people stepped forward and said, it's about time you ask who we are. And they identified themselves as Wendat. And this is the 4 member tribes that became the Wendat Confederacy, the Huron Confederacy, as they're commonly known in the history books. And they were never recognized as a single Huron tribe. They were always recognized as 4 independent nations. They lived on the, and I tried to pronounce that, Pettatanguanese Peninsula, which that is the peninsula that juts out between the Georgian Bay and Lake Simcoe. But I and Dr. Kopris, when I was writing On the Back of a Turtle, I spent a lot of time trying to research the origin of the name Wendat, because there was this myth, if you will, that all the Iroquoian tribes basically referred to themselves as Wendat. That was actually a theory that was presented pretty heavily about 15, 16 years ago. And I won't say who the origin of that was, but Dr. Kopris and I, we tried to research out if there were other nations besides the 4 of the Wendat Confederacy that called themselves Wendats. And Dr. Kopris basically made the statement, as far as I know, no one was ever actually referred to as Wendat except for the Wendats themselves. So Dr. Kopris, looking at the language, the differences between Wyandotte and Wendat, shows, and we'll see here in a little bit, that they're sister languages, that they didn't spawn one from the other, which means that there was no one else but these 4 nations that referred to themselves as being WENDAT. And those are the four nations there. All four of these nations were destroyed by the Iroquoian people, except for this one, which is the longest name of the four. Can anybody tell me who this tribe became? Who are these people? Because they still live today where these other three do not.
Is that the Huron-Wendat?
They are the Huron-Wendat, absolutely. They are the only surviving nation, intact nation from the Wendat Confederacy. And they basically survived because they initially sought seclusion on Christian Island, which is in Georgian Bay. Then once the four nations actually crumbled, they moved to Quebec with the Jesuits and had protection there for many years. But this is the only surviving nation of the Wendat Confederacy. And they still live in Quebec, and they are in history, the Huron of Lorette, the Huron-Wendats, and they are a strong cousin. They are a very strong cousin of the Wyandotte people. Okay, moving back to where we were. So we have the Huron-Wendat, then we have the Huron-Wyandotte, and there's a big difference. We're cousins to the Wendats. We're not Wendat. The Wendat aren't Wyandotte. We can't claim to be Wendat, and the Wendat can't claim to be Wyandotte. That sounds a little complicated, but we are very close cousins. And the closest cousin that we actually have that is still alive today, and I didn't put it on the slide, but does anybody know who our closest cousins are? Who are our closest Iroquoian cousins that are still alive today? The Seneca people. They are also from the Adirondack Confederacy. They are one of the neutral nations, if you will, and they are our closest living relatives. It's the Seneca side. They do not come from the Seneca proper. They basically were adopted into the Seneca nation, and they took on the Seneca name because the Seneca would not allow them for the longest time to identify themselves as being unique. They had to incorporate their traditions, their beliefs into the Seneca. They had to become Seneca. They lived basically in Pennsylvania, the area around Pennsylvania. That's where they were placed when they were adopted. And they gave the presence of being Seneca, but they never gave up their identity. Not long after the French and Indian War began on the North American continent, this new tribe of people just kind of showed up because they got the strength and began to identify themselves as the Mingo. And you will see the Mingo in history. So the Seneca Cayuga, and that's another derogatory name that comes from the Delaware language. And the Mingo basically became the Seneca, who are the Seneca Cayuga today. They are our closest living relatives. There were a number of people who were adopted into the turtle, the deer, and the wolf tribes. These were actual nations, not tribes. They were nations of people, nations because the turtle, the wolf, and the deer, they had their own clans. They had their own shamanic beliefs. They had their own tribal governments. And when they came together and formed the Wyandotte people, they basically merged those three traditions into one. And that tradition is who we are today, with the addition of some other people, because there was a small remnant of the ATTIWANDARONK that were incorporated into these three nations, because the WENRORONON basically sought shelter and protection among the ATTIWANDARONK, the Bear Nation of the Wendats, mainly because the Wendats, Bear Nation, had a bunch of turtle clans. And the WENRORONON were known as the turtle people. They had exclusive turtle clans. So when they were defeated by the Seneca, they basically went to the area between Georgian Bay, Lake Simcoe, were absorbed into the ATTIWANDARONK. When they were defeated, they basically slid right into their old cousins, the wolf and the deer, and then they became the Wyandotte people. In time, other tribes had captives that were adopted in, in small numbers, but there was one other tribe that had a large number of captives that were adopted into the Wyandotte people, and that's the Fox. They were ardent enemies of our grandmas and grandpas, and we absolutely loved the way they fought. They were vicious in war. They were a lot like us because we were also very diplomatic up until the point that people decided that they didn't want our diplomacy. And when they didn't want our diplomacy, we went in and just obliterated them. And the Fox were much the same way as we. So they adopted a lot of Fox captives into the Wyandotte people. And the Fox people, the Meskwaki, basically became our Snake clan. The Snake clan, long time ago, was predominantly Meskwaki. The Huron tribe, the Great Dispersal of 1651, 1652 were the remnants of our four parent nations. They fled to the Wisconsin wilderness because they had the Haudenosaunee people not looking now to adopt them like they did their other neutral cousins, because they defied the Iroquois' great peace. They had this mark. Their constitution basically said that since they defied the great peace of the Iroquoian Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee people, that they no longer deserve to live. So the Haudenosaunee basically sought the absolute destruction of our grandmas and grandpas. They were not going to take captives. They were not going to try and adopt them. They were going to kill them, every single one, woman, child, elder, whomever. It was all out war. They fled to the Wisconsin wilderness, seeking basically protection because of the distance. And also there were other nations out there, the Siouan people, who the Iroquois didn't really want to go fight just yet because they numbered in tens of thousands. As the people were living in the Wisconsin wilderness, a lot of the tribes basically began to congregate on the southern shore of Lake Superior. And I'm not going to try and pronounce the bay, but a lot of the tribes began to congregate on the southern shore of Lake Superior because the fishing, the pelts, the hunting was exquisite. In 1659, a French trapper and explorer, Pierre Esprit Radisson, showed up out there and just dropped himself into all these different nations. He identified most of them as being Siouan, Algonquian, but there was one other group of people that he couldn't quite identify. They stood out as being different and weird. He had no idea who they were, but they knew that they were not they were not Siouan and they were not Algonquian. They were a people that he could not identify. So he returned to Montreal in 1660, and he gave a report to Father Rene Menard. And Father Menard identified these people as being the survivors of the Huron mission. He identified these people from the descriptions of their clothing, their language, the adornments that they wore, that they were Iroquoian people. They were Hurons. They were Hurons because of being part of the Huron mission, not because they were part of the Huron Confederacy or the Wendat Confederacy. Because these people, outside of those from the ATTIWANDARONK who were absorbed into the tribe, there is no association that these people had with the Huron Confederacy. The problem we have is at that time, the French still did not care who these people were. They were just Hurons from the Huron mission. And you can't really argue with the French. They're difficult to argue with because, like us, they're bullheaded and they don't merge and bend in a lot of things that they firmly believe in. They identified the people as Huron. They didn't want to know who the people were. So the name Huron stuck. So for the next almost 100 years, we became known as the Huron tribe, not referencing the Huron Confederacy, but referencing the Huron mission, surviving remnants of the Huron mission. It wasn't until the year 1748 that the name Wyandotte first shows up in the historical records. On September 6th, 1748, Colonel Conrad Weiser, he was a Pennsylvanian, a Dutchman who was sent out west to do a survey of the Ohio country. to also make contact with the various tribes that were there and to start forming alliances with these tribes. The year before, in 1747, Chief Nicholas, he had a little bit of a difference with the French in Detroit. He also had a little bit of a difference with the other two people groups that identified themselves as Huron, the deer and the wolf. And he said, basically, I'm done with you guys because I want to basically be who I am. I don't want to be a Huron, which that is nothing to me because I am a turtle people. I am Porcupine because Nicholas was of the Porcupine clan. He was basically the war chief. He was the war pole, and he was a little stern. And he basically told the French to go French themselves. So he tried to overthrow the French. That didn't work. He ended up moving into the Sandusky River shed, and in time ventured out where he went, boom, into Conrad Weiser. Conrad Weiser was basically an Englishman. They had a different precept on who these people were. They had a little bit more respect for them, but they had an ultimate bad plan for their demise. So Conrad Weiser goes, hey, who are you guys? And whoever it was that he was in council muttered a name, Wendat. And that over time became anglicized into Wyandotte. And Dr. Kopras also says that it is unattainable to hold that the Wyandotte's name for themselves is descended from the Hurons' name for themselves, which he was referencing the Hurons as being the Wendats. So we are unique people. And we have traveled the Great Lakes area all the way from our dispersal here, because we basically were originating down in this area here in Pennsylvania, New York. We got defeated. We came up here to the area where the Wendats lived. They got defeated. We went to the Wyandotte. They got defeated. We came back down here to the parent tribes of the ATTIWANDARONK. They got defeated, and then we just dispersed. Because our grandmas and grandpas, they were not about to be adopted. They were not about to give up their identity. They were not going to secede who they were as a people and what they believed to these Haudenosaunee people. They wanted to live. They wanted to survive. They wanted to move on. They wanted to be unique. They had this defiant, I'm going to live attitude. And here we are today because of our grandmas and grandpas. We still have that attitude. We are Wyandotte. And that is how we became the Wyandotte tribe. It's a lot of stuff there, guys. Any questions? And then there's silence. Everybody pondering it? Okay. I will give the slides to Kim and she will give those to everybody. I hope everybody got the slides from last month, but this is who we are. And we're strong, we're a proud people. And being Wyandotte it's a great thing, guys. So that's all I have. Thanks.
Melinda said, I don't
Thank you,
think I
Lloyd.
got slides. I will get. Something happened right after our thing last time, and I got distracted, so I don't think I did send those out. So I will send last times and this times again, probably tomorrow. No, sorry, Thursday.
Need a reminder?
I may.
I'll put it on my calendar.
All right. Does anybody have any questions
right.
for Lloyd?
Tisha May, Lloyd.
You're welcome.
Monet.
Okay.
I think
These are
Lloyd
all-
doesn't feel as well as he did last month.
No, I don't feel good at all right now. Last I checked, I had just shy of 103 fever.
You shouldn't be at work.